February 8th, 2021. The news broke quietly, but the devastation was absolute. 214 shops permanently shuttered. 2,400 staff members told they no longer had jobs. The shutters came down on a high street institution, never to rise again. For over a century, Dorothy Perkins was the queen of the British High Street. At its dizzying peak, it operated nearly 600 branches across the country. It was the place where generations of women bought their first interview outfits, where Saturday shopping trips in bustling town centres and retail parks always included a browse through its racks. It was a guaranteed fixture, as familiar as the pavement itself. Now, it is a ghost. The physical empire has been entirely erased, stripped down to a mere logo on a fast fashion website, leaving gaping dark windows in shopping centres from Newcastle to Newquay. How does a beloved national treasure, deeply woven into the fabric of British life for 112 years, simply vanish from the physical world? The answer isn't just a story of the pandemic or the ruthless rise of online shopping. It is a cautionary tale of crippling corporate debt, a retail empire that lost its identity, and a high street left behind by time. From a single shilling blouse in 1909 to the collapse of the Arcadia Empire, this is how Britain lost one of its defining fashion staples. Before the sprawling retail parks and the relentless pace of online fast fashion giants, the British High Street was an entirely different world. It was a place of local butchers, independent bakers, and modest shopfronts. In 1909, amidst this traditional landscape, a small business named H.P. Newman opened its doors, specializing primarily in ladies' hosiery and underwear. It was a quiet, unassuming beginning for a company that would eventually grow to define women's retail across the United Kingdom. By 1919, the directors realized that if they were to expand, they needed a name that truly resonated with the British public. They needed something familiar, elegant, yet entirely approachable. They chose Dorothy Perkins. The name was not borrowed from a founder or a famous socialite, but rather inspired by a popular, classic English climbing rose. It was an early masterstroke of retail branding. A Dorothy Perkins rose was robust, beautiful, and found blooming in gardens up and down the country. The shop aimed to be exactly the same: reliable, attractive, and accessible to the everyday woman, no matter which town centre she happened to be walking through. In the early decades of the 20th century, British fashion was heavily stratified by class. High-end department stores and exclusive boutiques catered to the wealthy, while affordable clothing for the working classes was often strictly utilitarian, focusing on durability rather than style. Dorothy Perkins brilliantly identified the gaping void in the middle. They became famous across the country for their 1 shilling blouse, a meticulously designed garment that offered a genuine taste of elegance without alienating the working and middle-class women who formed the backbone of the British economy. It was nothing short of a retail revelation. A woman could walk down her local high street, step off the pavement and into the shop, and purchase something that made her feel thoroughly put together, all for a single shilling. The shop floor itself became a sanctuary of accessible femininity. Behind polished wooden counters, impeccably dressed shop assistants, who often knew their regular customers by name, would carefully wrap purchases in crisp paper. It was a dignified shopping experience available at a working-class price point. Following the trauma of the Second World War, as Britain slowly rebuilt and the austerity of clothes rationing finally came to an end, a new era of consumer optimism swept across the nation. Town centres began to regenerate, and Dorothy Perkins was perfectly positioned to capture this post-war mood. The brand expanded aggressively yet thoughtfully throughout the 1950s. They opened shops in bustling market towns, emerging suburbs, and growing city centres alike. They understood the psychology of their core demographic implicitly. The British woman wanted value for her money, but she also wanted to feel valued herself. Shopping in this era was a social event. Women would dress up to visit the high street, and popping into Dorothy Perkins became an integral part of that weekly routine. It was the trusted destination for a new cardigan, a reliable skirt, or the perfect pair of stockings. By the end of the 1950s, Dorothy Perkins had laid a formidable foundation. It was no longer just a humble hosiery shop. It was a deeply trusted friend on the British High Street, boasting dozens of profitable branches. However, the swinging 60s were rapidly approaching. A cultural and retail revolution was on the horizon, one that would test whether this familiar English rose could adapt to a loud new world of masque. As the 1960s dawned, Britain was a nation undergoing a profound cultural transformation. The youthquake was in full swing, hemlines were rising, and the grey, utilitarian mindset of the post-war years was being decisively swept away by a tidal wave of colour, music, and pop culture. For a retailer built on sensible hosiery and modest blouses, this rapid shift could have been a death knell. Instead, Dorothy Perkins orchestrated one of the most successful evolutions in British retail history. Sensing that the modern British woman wanted an entirely new wardrobe, the brand expanded its offerings far beyond underwear and knitwear. They introduced matching separates, fashionable dresses, and bold prints. However, their true genius lay in their refusal to alienate their core customer base. While boutiques like Bieber and Bazaar in London catered to the ultra-trendy, metropolitan elite, Dorothy Perkins brought the flavour of the swinging 60s to the everyday high streets of Bolton, Bristol and Birmingham. They democratised fashion, ensuring that a stylish, contemporary outfit was not a luxury reserved for the wealthy, but an accessible reality for the working and middle classes. By the 1970s and 1980s, the brand had firmly established itself as the undisputed queen of the British high street. This was the golden age of physical retail, an era long before smartphones and next-day delivery, when the Saturday shopping trip was a cherished, multi-generational ritual. Picture a typical Saturday morning in a bustling British town centre during this era. The pavements were thronged with families. Teenagers congregated outside record shops, whilst mothers and daughters navigated the crowded high street with purpose. Stepping into a Dorothy Perkins shop was a distinct sensory experience. Out of the cold, perhaps drizzly British weather, customers were greeted by bright, warm lighting, the soft hum of chatter, and rows upon rows of neatly organised garments. It was a space that felt safe, welcoming, and inherently female. The shops were designed to be navigated easily, with friendly staff, often local women themselves, ready behind the tills to offer advice or wrap purchases. Leaving the shop with a distinctive Dorothy Perkins paper bag swinging from your wrist was a minor badge of honour. It meant you had secured something smart, reliable, and reasonably priced. What made the brand so incredibly resilient during this peak era was its unparalleled intergenerational appeal. It was entirely common for a 16-year-old girl to buy her very first smart outfit for a Saturday job at Dorothy Perkins, while her mother purchased a dependable floral dress for a summer holiday, and her grandmother found a comfortable, well-made cardigan. The brand walked a brilliant tightrope. It was fashion-conscious without being intimidatingly trendy, and it was affordable without ever feeling cheap. They understood that the average British woman was not walking a runway. She was going to the office, attending a local wedding, taking the children to school, or heading out for a pub lunch on a Sunday. Dorothy Perkins provided the uniform for real British life. As shopping habits evolved, so did the company's footprint. When purpose-built, covered shopping centres began to dominate the architectural landscape in the late 1970s and 1980s, Dorothy Perkins was always an anchor tenant. From the Arndale centres of the north to the sprawling retail parks that began to encircle major cities, the familiar, elegant logo was a guaranteed fixture. By the 1990s, the scale of the operation was staggering. The brand had swelled to nearly 600 branches across the United Kingdom. It was woven so deeply into the geographical and cultural fabric of the country that it was almost impossible to imagine a British town centre without one. Financially, the brand was a powerhouse. It was shifting millions of garments a year, boasting immense footfall and a fiercely loyal customer base that spanned decades. The till receipts were long, and the profit margins were incredibly healthy. Dorothy Perkins had successfully navigated the journey from a single shop selling 1-shilling blouses to a colossal fashion empire. Yet, in the increasingly aggressive landscape of late 20th century capitalism, such monumental success brings its own distinct perils. When a high street chain becomes this ubiquitous and this profitable, it ceases to be viewed merely as a beloved shop by those at the top. Instead, it becomes a highly lucrative corporate asset. As the new millennium approached, the retail industry was changing. The focus was shifting from local communities and customer loyalty to shareholder value, aggressive expansion, and complex financial structuring. Dorothy Perkins, with its hundreds of prime high street locations and massive cash flow, had become a glittering prize in the eyes of corporate giants. The era of the trusted, independent high street favorite was drawing to a close. A new era, one defined by corporate megagroups, retail tycoons, and ruthless profit extraction, was about to begin, and Dorothy Perkins was about to be swallowed whole. By the turn of the millennium, the nature of British retail was undergoing a seismic shift. The days of the high street being dominated by independent chains, each fiercely guarding its own unique identity and directly serving its local community, were fading fast. The new era was defined by aggressive consolidation. Brands were no longer just shops, they were puzzle pieces to be assembled into massive corporate portfolios. Dorothy Perkins, with its immense cash flow, prime high street locations, and vast, loyal customer base, had long been absorbed into the Burton Group. But it was in 2002 that the brand's destiny was fundamentally altered, when the newly formed Arcadia Group was famously acquired by the billionaire businessman Sir Philip Green. Green was widely hailed by the press as the undisputed king of the British high street. His business model was brutally effective: acquire established retail brands, centralize their operations, aggressively drive down supplier costs through sheer economies of scale, and extract maximum profit margins. Under the Arcadia umbrella, Dorothy Perkins found itself sharing a stable with an array of other famous high street names, including Burton, Wallace, Evans, Miss Selfridge, and the jewel in the crown, Topshop. In the immediate years following the takeover, the Arcadia strategy felt like a triumphant success. The group was generating astonishing, record-breaking profits. For Dorothy Perkins, this era was characterized by a ruthless, forensic focus on the bottom line. Expansion continued, but the geography of that expansion was changing. While the brand maintained its presence in traditional town centers, heavy investment was pivoted towards out-of-town retail parks. These sprawling complexes, built on the edges of towns and cities, offered cheaper leases and massive, hangar-like units surrounded by vast car parks. They were highly convenient for the modern, car-driving British family, but they lacked the soul, the intimacy, and the community integration of the traditional high street. Inside these retail park units, the Dorothy Perkins shopping experience began to subtly shift. The shops felt larger, brighter, but undeniably more clinical. The polished wooden counters and personal service of the past were replaced by dense racks of volume-driven inventory and long queues at the tills. The focus was no longer on curating a wardrobe for the customer, but on shifting as much volume as humanly possible. Yet, beneath the staggering financial dividends being paid out at the top of the Arcadia empire, a dangerous structural hierarchy was forming within the group itself. A retail conglomerate with so many brands naturally develops favorites, and it quickly became apparent that Topshop was the golden child. Throughout the 2000s, Topshop was transformed into a global fashion phenomenon. It was given the prime location at London's Oxford Circus. It secured highly publicized, exclusive collaborations with supermodels like Kate Moss. It became the ultimate destination for the trendy, fashion-forward youth, commanding immense cultural relevance and receiving the lion's share of Arcadia's creative investment and marketing budget. In stark contrast, Dorothy Perkins was relegated to the role of the dependable, unglamorous workhorse. It was expected to quietly generate massive, reliable revenues to help fund the group's wider ambitions, but it received a fraction of the creative energy. It became the neglected middle child of the Arcadia family. This lack of distinct investment led to a creeping, fatal dilution of the brand's identity. For decades, Dorothy Perkins knew exactly who its customer was. But as the 2000s progressed, its positioning became dangerously blurred. Was it aiming for the young professional looking for affordable office wear? The busy mother needing weekend basics? Or the older woman seeking comfortable, familiar styles? In attempting to cast the widest possible net to maintain its massive volume targets, Dorothy Perkins began to produce collections that were safe, middle-of-the-road, and increasingly generic. While its glamorous sibling, Topshop, was setting the cultural agenda, Dorothy Perkins was relying on its historical momentum. The clothing racks were filled with sensible cardigans, basic trousers, and polite floral tops. The quality of the fabrics, squeezed by the relentless drive for higher margins, began to noticeably decline. The brand that had once democratized elegance for the British working and middle classes was slowly transforming into a purveyor of disposable, unremarkable volume. At the time, these internal compromises were heavily masked by the sheer scale of the operation. The tills were still ringing, the retail parks were full of weekend shoppers, and the Arcadia Group seemed invincible. But in retail, when a brand stops innovating and begins relying entirely on the affection of its past, it starts living on borrowed time. The high street was about to be hit by a wave of hyper-competitive, ultra-cheap fast fashion, and Dorothy Perkins, burdened by corporate expectations, starved of creative investment, and losing its distinct voice, was walking straight into the storm. As the 2000s unfolded, the British high street became a brutal, unforgiving battleground. The rules of retail engagement were being rewritten at a dizzying pace, and the traditional stalwarts who had dominated for decades suddenly found themselves fighting a war on two entirely different fronts. For Dorothy Perkins, already weakened by years of creative neglect and corporate complacency, this new era proved to be a storm it was fundamentally ill-equipped to weather. The first devastating blow came from the physical high street itself, in the form of hyper-cheap, high-volume fast fashion. At the vanguard of this revolution was Primark. Primark did not just offer cheaper clothes, it fundamentally altered the psychology of British shopping. It introduced the concept of disposable fashion on a massive, unprecedented scale. A Saturday shopping trip was no longer about carefully selecting a single, well-made dress or a dependable jumper. Instead, it became a frantic, basket-filling exercise. Teenagers and young women were walking out of massive Primark stores with heavily stuffed brown paper bags, having purchased entire outfits for the price of a single Dorothy Perkins blouse. Against this aggressive price war, Dorothy Perkins was instantly paralyzed. Tied to its mid-tier pricing structure, it could not possibly match the rock-bottom price tags of the discount giants. Yet, because its parent company had relentlessly squeezed supplier costs and fabric quality to maximize profit margins, Dorothy Perkins could no longer justify its higher prices through superior craftsmanship. Customers were walking in, feeling the thin, synthetic fabrics, checking the price tags, and simply walking out again. The brand suddenly looked fundamentally overpriced for what was essentially basic, uninspired clothing. Simultaneously, a second, even more lethal threat was emerging from the digital realm. The rise of online-only retailers like ASOS, Boohoo, and Missguided completely transformed the expectations of the younger British demographic. These digital natives did not want to spend their Saturdays trawling through physical shops. They wanted trend-led clothing, heavily influenced by social media and reality television, ordered from their smartphones and delivered to their doorstep the very next day. Dorothy Perkins's response to the e-commerce revolution was painfully slow and glaringly inadequate. While its digital rivals were building sleek, user-friendly apps and offering frictionless returns, the Arcadia Group's online infrastructure remained clunky and outdated. Buying from Dorothy Perkins online often felt like a chore, an afterthought from a company that still fundamentally believed the physical high street would reign supreme forever. Caught in the terrifying crossfire between the ultra-cheap physical discounters and the ultra-fast digital innovators, Dorothy Perkins suffered the most dangerous fate a retailer can face, a complete loss of identity. It became stranded in a retail no-man's land. In a desperate bid to win back footfall, the brand attempted to be everything to everyone. They tried injecting younger, trendier pieces into their collections, but these attempts felt forced and inauthentic, failing completely to lure younger shoppers away from ASOS or Topshop. Conversely, this sudden shift alienated their core demographic. The clothing racks became a confusing, disjointed mishmash of styles. You could find a sequin party top hanging next to a sensible, elasticated waist skirt, with neither item particularly appealing to the customer who might actually want it. Inevitably, the brand became saddled with the most toxic reputation in fashion. It was perceived as frumpy. It became affectionately but damningly known as the shop you visited only if you were a mum or a nana. However, the tragic irony was that even the mothers and grandmothers, the fiercely loyal customers who had sustained the brand since the 1980s, were beginning to defect. The older, value-conscious British shopper had discovered supermarket clothing. George at Asda, F&F at Tesco, and Chew at Sainsbury's were producing basics that were just as good, if not better, than those found in Dorothy Perkins, and they could be conveniently thrown into the trolley alongside the weekly grocery shop. If these women wanted something of slightly higher quality, they walked straight into Next or Marks & Spencer. There was simply no compelling reason left to make a dedicated trip to a Dorothy Perkins store. By the middle of the 2000s, stepping into a Dorothy Perkins branch was a strangely melancholy experience. The vibrant, bustling energy of the 1980s and 1990s had evaporated. The shops often felt too quiet, the lighting a little too harsh, the air filled with an uninspiring playlist rather than the lively chatter of excited shoppers. Most tellingly, the red sale signs had become a permanent, desperate fixture in the windows. When a brand relies on continuous, year-round discounting just to tempt people across the threshold, it is a glaring signal that the merchandise itself has lost its intrinsic value. Dorothy Perkins had become a ghost of its former self, clinging to its prime real estate out of sheer historical habit. The brand was aging, its customer base was disappearing, and its identity was fractured beyond repair. Yet, as severe as this crisis of identity was, it was only a symptom of a much darker, systemic rot. The true poison-killing Dorothy Perkins was not just changing fashion trends, it was the suffocating financial architecture of the empire that owned it. The walls were closing in, and the weight of the Arcadia Group was about to crush the life out of the High Street Queen. While the identity of Dorothy Perkins was quietly eroding on the shop floor, a far more destructive force was acting upon the brand from above. To fully comprehend the collapse of this high street giant, one must look past the confusing fashion lines and the outdated floral dresses, and examine the crushing financial architecture of its parent company. Dorothy Perkins was not merely a victim of changing consumer tastes, it was slowly suffocated by the immense burden of the Arcadia Group. The retail model of the early 2000s, driven by corporate acquisitions, relied heavily on extracting maximum capital from established brands. In 2005, Arcadia's owners famously paid out a historic £1.2 billion dividend. At the time, it was celebrated as a masterclass in business profitability. But in retail, starving a company of capital during its most profitable years leaves it fundamentally defenseless when the weather turns. As the 2000s progressed, the lack of reinvestment in Dorothy Perkins became impossible to ignore. A brand that relies on a physical presence must continuously update its environment to make the shopping experience aspirational, or at the very least, pleasant. But inside a typical Dorothy Perkins, the decay was palpable. The once bright shopping centre units were looking decidedly tired. Carpets were threadbare, paint was chipping around the skirting boards, and the fitting rooms, crucial spaces where a customer actually decides to part with their money, felt neglected and dated, often illuminated by harsh, unforgiving strip lighting. This lack of capital expenditure was a fatal error in an era where shoppers demanded an experience. But the company was trapped. The money required to overhaul hundreds of aging shops simply was not there, having been siphoned off or diverted to prop up the wider empire. Compounding this was a uniquely British retail crisis, the lethal combination of inflexible leases and crippling business rates. During the expansionist boom of the 1980s and 1990s, retailers gleefully signed 25-year leases with upward-only rent reviews. Landlords in prime town centres and retail parks had locked brands like Dorothy Perkins into astronomical rental agreements that bore absolutely no relation to the declining footfall outside their doors. Furthermore, physical retailers in the UK are subjected to business rates. a heavy property tax based on the theoretical rental value of the shop. While online-only competitors operated out of massive, cheap warehouses on industrial estates, paying a fraction of the tax, Dorothy Perkins was bleeding cash just to keep its doors open on the high street. The physical estate, once the brand's greatest asset, had morphed into a colossal, suffocating albatross around its neck. The shops had to shift massive volumes of clothing merely to pay the rent and the rates, long before a single penny of profit could be recorded. By 2019, the situation had shifted from a chronic, slow decline to an acute, existential crisis. The Arcadia Group, burdened by its vast, over-rented property portfolio and mounting debts, was fighting a desperate battle for survival. The empire was cracking, and Dorothy Perkins was on the front line of the collapse. In May of that year, the management proposed a company voluntary arrangement, CVA. In the British retail lexicon, a CVA is often the last roll of the dice. It is a legally binding agreement that allows a struggling company to break its leases, shut down its most unprofitable shops, and aggressively demand rent reductions from its landlords in a bid to avoid immediate administration. For the staff working in Dorothy Perkins shops across the country, the announcement of the CVA was deeply traumatic. Shop assistants, many of whom had given decades of loyal service to the company, arrived for their shifts under a dark cloud of uncertainty. The staff rooms, once places of friendly chatter and shared tea breaks, became hushed and anxious. Would their branch be on the closure list? Would they be able to pay their mortgages next month? The negotiations were bitter and highly publicized. Landlords, furious at being asked to shoulder the burden of Arcadia's historic underinvestment, threatened to vote down the restructuring plan. For weeks, the fate of Dorothy Perkins hung precariously in the balance. Ultimately, the CVA was narrowly approved. Landlords agreed to rent cuts of up to 50% on certain properties, and Arcadia announced the immediate closure of dozens of shops across its portfolio. The immediate threat of total collapse was averted, but the CVA was nothing more than a sticking plaster on a gaping wound. It addressed the symptoms, the crippling rent, but did absolutely nothing to cure the underlying disease. It did not magically fix the uninspired clothing lines. It did not upgrade the clunky website, and it certainly did not bring the missing customers back to the high street. Instead, the CVA marked the beginning of a grim, physical retreat. For the first time in its history, the map of the United Kingdom was steadily losing its Dorothy Perkins pins. Once profitable branches in familiar shopping centres were quietly emptied of their stock. The staff packed up the tills, locked the doors for the final time, and handed the keys back to the landlords. The empire had managed to buy itself a little more time, but the structural damage was terminal. Dorothy Perkins was shrinking, its presence fading from the towns it had served for a century. The high street was beginning to hollow out, and the visual impact of this corporate decay was about to become painfully obvious to every shopper in the country. The company voluntary arrangement had bought the Arcadia Group a temporary stay of execution, but on the ground, the reality of the British high street was painting a distinctly grim picture. As the 2000s drew to a close, a palpable sense of melancholy had settled over the nation's town centres and retail parks. The bustling, vibrant Saturday shopping trips that had built the Dorothy Perkins empire were now firmly a relic of a bygone era. To walk down a typical British high street in late 2019 was to witness the physical manifestation of corporate decline. The ecosystem of retail was collapsing. As major names fell into administration or scaled back their physical footprints, Dorothy Perkins shops increasingly found themselves surrounded by whitewashed windows and boarded-up neighbours. The symbiotic relationship of the high street, where a customer might pop into the butcher, browse a bookshop, and then treat herself to a new blouse at Dorothy Perkins, was entirely broken. The footfall, the lifeblood of any physical retailer, was simply vanishing. Inside the remaining Dorothy Perkins branches, the atmosphere was a stark departure from the warm, inviting sanctuaries of the past. The shops felt hollow. Without the steady stream of customers to provide energy and movement, the large units in shopping centres felt cavernous and awkwardly quiet. The soundtrack of the shop floor was no longer the cheerful hum of conversation and the constant, rhythmic ringing of the tills. Instead, it was often the low, irritating drone of the fluorescent lighting and the sound of a single pair of footsteps echoing across the linoleum. For the staff, this period was an exercise in slow, agonizing demoralization. These were not faceless corporate drones. They were local women, many of whom had worked for the brand for years, if not decades. They remembered the golden days when the queues for the fitting rooms stretched down the aisles, and when taking deliveries of the new autumn collections felt like a genuine event. Now their days were spent meticulously straightening the same racks of unsold garments, trying to look busy in a shop that nobody was visiting. They stood behind the tills, watching the occasional shopper drift in, idly flick through a rail of cardigans, and wander out again without making a purchase. The emotional toll of working in a dying shop is profound. The staff lived with the constant gnawing anxiety that their branch would be the next one, quietly added to a closure list. Every unannounced visit from an area manager sent ripples of panic through the back rooms. The visual desperation of the brand was impossible to hide from the British public. The shop windows, once carefully curated displays of aspirational seasonal fashion, had become chaotic billboards of distress. The red sale posters, previously reserved for Boxing Day or the end of the summer season, had become a permanent fixture. Mid-season sale, up to 70% off. Everything must go. The messaging was relentless. When a brand is forced to permanently slash its prices simply to generate enough cash flow to keep the lights on, it fundamentally destroys its own value. Customers are not naive. They quickly learn that there is absolutely no reason to buy a Dorothy Perkins dress at full price on a Tuesday, because by Friday it will inevitably be discounted. The clothing had lost its cachet. It was no longer fashion. It was merely inventory waiting to be liquidated. Dorothy Perkins was existing on life support. It was a zombie brand, sustained not by genuine consumer demand, but by the sheer inertia of its own massive history. It was too big to instantly vanish, yet too broken to successfully adapt. The business model was incredibly fragile, requiring every single piece of the retail puzzle: the supply chain, the landlords, the seasonal weather, and the remaining loyal customers, to hold perfectly steady just to avoid total collapse. But the world does not hold steady for struggling retailers. As 2019 bled into 2020, the retail industry was nervously looking at the horizon, wondering how long this slow decay could possibly drag on. The high street was heavily fragmented. The empire was drowning in debt, and the shops were empty. They needed a miracle. Instead, they got a catastrophe. As the cold winds of early 2020 swept across the British Isles, whispers of a novel virus spreading across the globe began to dominate the news cycles. A storm of unprecedented magnitude was gathering, one that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of human interaction and completely shut down the British high street. For Dorothy Perkins, hovering on the absolute brink of failure, this was not just a disruption. It was the final, devastating blow. On the evening of March the 23rd, 2020, the British Prime Minister addressed the nation and issued an unprecedented instruction: stay at home. To halt the spread of the novel coronavirus, all non-essential retail was ordered to close immediately. Across the United Kingdom, the shutters came down on high streets, shopping centres, and retail parks. A profound, unnatural silence descended upon the country's commercial heartlands. For Dorothy Perkins, this was not merely a disruption, it was an apocalyptic event. The brand had entered the year critically weak, heavily reliant on a delicate, continuous cycle of cash flow, just to service its monumental rent and debt obligations. Overnight, that cash flow dropped to absolute zero. The physical shops were frozen in a bizarre, melancholy snapshot of time. Behind the locked glass doors and pulled shutters, the mannequins still proudly wore the new spring collections: lightweight cardigans, pastel blouses, and floral dresses intended for Easter family gatherings and spring weddings that would never happen. Dust slowly began to gather on the polished shoulders of the displays. Inside the dark, silent units, the tills were empty. The escalators were switched off. and the racks of clothing sat entirely undisturbed. The British government's furlough scheme provided a vital lifeline for the staff, ensuring they received a portion of their wages while they sat anxiously at home. But for the Arcadia Group, the financial arithmetic was horrifying. While staff costs were subsidized, the massive pile of corporate debt remained, and the aggressive landlords were still legally owed their rent. The fragile sticking plaster of the 2019 CVA was violently ripped away. When the first lockdown restrictions were tentatively eased in the summer of 2020, the high street that cautiously reopened was unrecognizable. Shopping was no longer a leisurely Saturday pastime. It was a strictly managed, highly stressful, logistical exercise. Customers had to queue outside at 2-meter intervals. Inside, the Dorothy Perkins shops were transformed by the harsh realities of pandemic retail. One-way systems taped onto the carpets, perspex screens erected at the tills, and hand sanitizer stations replacing the promotional displays at the entrance. Crucially, the fundamental reason for buying Dorothy Perkins clothing had evaporated. The brand heavily relied on workwear, smart casual weekend outfits, and occasion wear. But with millions of Britons now working from their kitchen tables in jogging bottoms, and with parties, holidays, and weddings entirely outlawed, there was simply no demand. Women did not need a new blazer for a Zoom call. The footfall that returned to the high street was sparse, purposeful, and thoroughly uninterested in buying fashion. The company was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. As autumn approached, a grim sense of inevitability began to settle over the Arcadia empire. The group desperately tried to secure emergency funding to plug the gaping hole in its finances. Behind closed doors, frantic negotiations took place with lenders, investors, and landlords. But the retail landscape was deeply toxic. Nobody was willing to throw hundreds of millions of pounds into a bloated, struggling physical retail group in the middle of a global pandemic. November in the British retail calendar is traditionally the golden quarter, the vital period leading up to Christmas where shops make the bulk of their annual profit. But in November 2020, England was plunged into a second national lockdown. The doors of Dorothy Perkins were forced shut once again, precisely when they needed to be selling winter coats and festive party wear. It was the lethal strike. In the final week of November, rumours began to leak into the financial press. The Arcadia Group was teetering on the absolute brink. Suppliers, sensing the impending catastrophe, panicked and began withholding deliveries, fearing they would never be paid. The fragile ecosystem of the business completely seized up. Then, on the evening of November 30th, 2020, the fatal announcement was made official. The Arcadia Group, the behemoth that had dominated British fashion for 2 decades, formally collapsed into administration. The retail king had been dethroned, and his empire had shattered. The shockwaves across the United Kingdom were profound. This was not a minor, regional chain quietly fading away. This was the largest high street collapse since the demise of Woolworths a decade earlier. 13,000 jobs across the Arcadia portfolio were instantly thrust into jeopardy, with thousands of those belonging to the loyal, long-serving staff of Dorothy Perkins. For the high street, it was a moment of profound reckoning. The sheer scale of the Arcadia footprint meant that almost every major shopping centre and town centre in the country was suddenly facing the prospect of massive empty units. Dorothy Perkins, once the reliable, elegant anchor of the British high street, was suddenly entirely at the mercy of insolvency practitioners. Deloitte was appointed as the administrator, tasked with the grim job of unpicking the ruins of the Arcadia empire. Their primary legal duty was not to save the high street nor to protect the jobs of the shop assistants, but to claw back as much money as possible for the group's creditors. The immediate strategy was to keep the brands trading. As the second national lockdown lifted in early December, Dorothy Perkins shops reopened their doors for what would be their final, tragic Christmas season. The atmosphere on the shop floor was utterly heartbreaking. The staff returned from furlough to a company that had technically died. They stood behind their tills, wearing festive jumpers and forced smiles, serving customers while knowing with near certainty that they would be unemployed in the new year. It was a uniquely cruel limbo. Shoppers, aware of the administration, flocked to the shops hunting for massive liquidation bargains. The brand that had once prided itself on accessible elegance was reduced to a chaotic jumble sale. The permanent sale signs that had plagued the windows for years were replaced by stark, unsentimental administration notices and "everything must go" banners. Behind the scenes, Deloitte desperately searched for a buyer. They hoped for a white knight, a wealthy investor, or a rival retail group willing to buy the Dorothy Perkins brand, take on the leases, and keep the physical shops open. But the harsh reality of 2020 retail quickly crushed that hope. The physical estate was viewed not as an asset, but as a toxic liability. The leases were still too expensive, the shops were still too big, and the high street was still too empty. Potential suitors looked at the books and all reached the exact same conclusion. The Dorothy Perkins name still held value, and the customer database was a goldmine, but the physical shops were utterly worthless. As Christmas came and went, the mood in the staff rooms turned from anxious hope to bitter resignation. The final collections were sold off at rock-bottom prices. The stock rooms grew empty, and they were not being replenished. The staff began to mentally prepare for the end. They had spent years dressing the women of Britain, keeping the high street alive through changing trends, recessions, and a pandemic. Now, they were merely caretakers waiting for the final instruction to turn the key in the lock for the last time. The physical empire of Dorothy Perkins was dead. It was now merely a matter of waiting for the undertakers to arrive. As the bleak winter of early 2021 dragged on, the United Kingdom remained under strict lockdown conditions, and the high street lay dormant. Behind the scenes, the administrators at Deloitte were frantically attempting to carve up the carcass of the Arcadia Group. The fate of Topshop, the former golden child, had already been sealed, snapped up by the online giant ASOS in a deal that aggressively excluded all physical shops. For the staff of Dorothy Perkins, watching their sister brand be brutally stripped of its brick-and-mortar presence, the writing was clearly on the wall. On February 8, 2021, the final, devastating verdict was delivered. The fast fashion conglomerate Boohoo Group announced it had reached a deal to acquire Dorothy Perkins alongside its stablemates, Wallace and Burton. The purchase price for all three historic British brands was a mere £25.2 million. To put that figure into perspective, it was a fraction of what Arcadia's owners used to extract in a single year's dividend. The queens of the high street had been tossed into the corporate bargain bin. But the most brutal aspect of the Boohoo deal was not the price tag. It was the clinical, ruthless nature of the acquisition. Boohoo was a purely digital beast, a company that thrived on massive warehouses, influencer marketing, and lightning-fast supply chains. They had absolutely no interest in paying expensive leases or dealing with physical shopfronts. Therefore, the deal was strictly for the intellectual property. Boohoo bought the Dorothy Perkins name, the website, the customer database, and the remaining warehouse inventory. Crucially, they explicitly rejected the physical estate. All 214 remaining Dorothy Perkins shops were entirely excluded from the purchase. The human cost of this digital acquisition was immediate and catastrophic. With a single stroke of a pen in a corporate boardroom, 2,400 staff members across the Dorothy Perkins, Wallace and Burton networks were made redundant. For the women who had staffed the tills, dressed the windows, and formed the backbone of the brand for decades, it was a profoundly undignified end. There were no golden handshakes or tearful, celebratory retirement parties. After giving their working lives to a trusted high street institution, thousands of loyal employees were unceremoniously discarded, left to navigate the worst employment market in modern history. Because the nation was still under pandemic lockdown restrictions, the final days of the physical shops were stripped of any communal closure. There could be no final rush of nostalgic shoppers coming in to say goodbye, no busy liquidation weekends where local residents cleared out the last remaining stock. The end happened behind locked doors and lowered security shutters. A skeleton crew of staff was brought into the shops for one final, deeply miserable task: packing up the remnants of the empire. They walked through the silent, dimly lit units, stripping the last garments from the mannequins and folding the remaining stock into cardboard boxes to be shipped off to Boohoo's distribution centres. The familiar, comforting infrastructure of a British shop, the branded hangers, the point-of-sale displays, the mannequins that had showcased a century of changing trends, were suddenly rendered entirely useless. It was a sterile, clinical autopsy of a once vibrant retail space. When the last box was taped shut, the staff collected their personal belongings from the back rooms. They turned off the harsh fluorescent lights, stepped out onto the quiet pavements, and locked the doors. The keys were handed back to the landlords, and the familiar Dorothy Perkins signs above the doors instantly transitioned from welcoming beacons into monuments of a dead era. In the immediate aftermath of the sale, Boohoo quickly migrated Dorothy Perkins onto its own sprawling e-commerce platform. Technically, the brand had survived. A customer could still type the name into a search engine, land on a web page, and order a dress to be delivered the next day. But this digital afterlife was a hollow, soulless imitation of the original. Dorothy Perkins had been violently severed from its roots. It was no longer a place. It was merely a tab on a website, sitting alongside dozens of other indistinguishable fast fashion labels. The carefully cultivated identity, the friendly shop assistants, the Saturdays spent browsing the rails, the tangible experience of trying on clothes in a warm, welcoming environment, had been entirely erased. The brand had been successfully digitized, but its soul had been left behind, locked inside 214 empty units scattered across the country. The high street had lost one of its oldest, most dependable friends, and the physical landscape of British retail was about to face the terrifying reality of the enormous, dark voids left in its wake. When the national lockdowns finally lifted in the spring of 2021 and the British public cautiously returned to their local town centres, they were confronted with a profoundly altered landscape. The disappearance of Dorothy Perkins, alongside its Arcadia sister brands, was not merely a corporate restructuring hidden away on financial balance sheets. It was a visible, architectural trauma inflicted upon the United Kingdom's high streets. The spaces left behind were not small, inconspicuous units tucked away down side alleys. For decades, Dorothy Perkins had operated as an anchor tenant. The brand occupied prime, high-footfall real estate, commanding corner plots in traditional market towns, vast floor spaces in covered shopping centres, and sprawling, purpose-built units in suburban retail parks. When the shutters came down for the final time, they created colossal, gaping voids in the very heart of British communities. The immediate aftermath was a visual blight. Brightly lit shop floors that had once showcased the latest seasonal trends were plunged into permanent darkness. The familiar, elegant signage was unceremoniously ripped down, leaving behind faded, ghost-like silhouettes of the lettering on the brickwork. Standardized, impersonal, to-let boards were hastily erected above the doors, but in a retail ecosystem entirely devastated by the pandemic and the aggressive shift to e-commerce, there were very few traditional retailers looking to expand into such massive, physical spaces. Slowly, the fate of these abandoned shops began to diverge, painting a stark picture of the new British retail reality. Some of the most highly sought-after locations in thriving cities were eventually carved up, their square footage divided to accommodate smaller, independent ventures or expanding coffee shop chains. In retail parks, the cavernous units were frequently swallowed up by the relentless march of discount giants, the likes of B&M, Home Bargains, and Poundland, reflecting a brutal economic shift where price, rather than aspiration, became the sole driver of physical footfall. However, in countless provincial towns and struggling regional shopping centres, the reality was far bleaker. The units simply remained empty. They sat boarded up, gathering dust and graffiti, serving as depressing monuments to a lost era of retail. The symbiotic ecosystem of the high street relied heavily on the footfall generated by massive names like Dorothy Perkins. Without the draw of the fashion giant, the smaller, neighbouring independent shops, the local cafes, the jewellers, the cobblers, suffered a devastating knock-on effect. The disappearance of the brand acted as a catalyst for wider town centre decay, accelerating a vicious cycle of declining visitor numbers and further shop closures. Yet, the true legacy of Dorothy Perkins cannot be measured solely in vacant square footage, lost business rates, or the changing facades of shopping centres. The most profound and irreversible loss was entirely invisible, the sudden erasure of a deeply ingrained cultural ritual. For over a century, from the era of the one-shilling blouse to the zenith of the 1990s retail boom, the brand had been a constant, reassuring presence in the lives of British women. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary, everyday existence. It was the backdrop to pivotal life moments, the panic of finding a suitable outfit for a first job interview, the joy of selecting a dress for a best friend's wedding, or the simple, comforting routine of a Saturday afternoon spent browsing the racks with a mother or a grandmother. The tragedy of the Boohoo acquisition was the fundamental misunderstanding of what made the brand special in the first place. By stripping Dorothy Perkins of its physical estate and reducing it to a mere tab on a fast fashion website, the new owners preserved the trademark but entirely destroyed the experience. You cannot replicate the tactile pleasure of running a hand over a fabric to check its weight on a smartphone screen. You cannot digitize the honest, reassuring advice of a local shop assistant who understands exactly how a certain cut will fit a specific body shape. And, most importantly, a digital checkout cart can never replace the social, intergenerational bonding of a physical shopping trip. The brand had thrived for generations precisely because it offered a physical sanctuary, a warm, welcoming, inherently female space on the high street. When the doors locked, that sanctuary was permanently demolished. Today, Dorothy Perkins technically survives. It continues to churn out clothing, heavily promoted by algorithms, targeted ads, and social media influencers, delivered in plastic mailing bags to doorsteps across the country. But to the millions of women who grew up walking its aisles, who remember the distinctive swing of its paper bags and the friendly chatter at the tills, the true Dorothy Perkins is already dead. It belongs to a lost epoch of British retail. It stands as a poignant reminder of an era when the high street was not merely a collection of transactional spaces, but the beating, communal heart of a town. The empire that survived 2 world wars, shifting social classes, and a century of changing hemlines was ultimately felled by corporate greed, insurmountable debt, and the ruthless efficiency of the internet. The shops may have vanished, the windows may be dark, and the brand may have been exiled to the digital realm, but the ghost of Dorothy Perkins will linger in the memories of British shoppers for decades to come, a phantom of the high street that once was. It is a strange modern irony that Dorothy Perkins still technically exists today. You can open a browser, click a button, and have a dress delivered to your door by tomorrow morning. But the brand that lives on a server is a ghost of the institution that once anchored the British high street. The name survives, but the soul has been irrevocably lost. The collapse of this century-old empire is a stark cautionary tale of corporate hubris, crippling retail leases, and a catastrophic failure to adapt. Yet, beyond the balance sheets and administration reports, it is a story about the profound, irreversible changing of British life. For over a century, retail was not merely a frictionless transaction. It was a destination. It was the Saturday morning ritual in the town centre, the reassuring advice of a familiar shop assistant, and the shared, intergenerational experience of mothers, daughters, and grandmothers navigating the clothing racks together. When the physical doors of Dorothy Perkins locked for the final time, the high street did not just lose a mid-market fashion retailer. Towns across the country lost a dependable, comforting friend. It proved that a business cannot survive on legacy alone, especially when its corporate owners treat it as a financial asset to be squeezed rather than a community pillar to be nurtured. Today, the sprawling retail parks and shopping centres may feel a little emptier, but the cultural imprint of Dorothy Perkins remains stubbornly alive. It lives on in the backs of wardrobes, in faded family photographs, and in the collective memory of millions of British women who grew up walking its brightly lit aisles. The signs may have been taken down, but the experience it provided will forever remain a cornerstone of our retail history. What are your personal memories of Dorothy Perkins? Did you buy your first interview outfit there? Or do you fondly remember weekend shopping trips with your mum or nan? Please share your stories in the comments below. They are a vital piece of the high street's history. If you found this documentary insightful, please subscribe to the channel and share the video as we continue to explore the vanished brands that defined British life.